Morning to you all. I'm Jules.
And I'm Taryn.
And we've had the privilege of working in global mobility together for, I would say, far too many years, right, Taryn? Both in an in-house and in an advisory capacity.
That's right, Jules. And, we really love what we do and are so excited to be launching this first session in the series of webinars that Mike's just mentioned on adopting a more strategic approach to mobility. K2 recently launched our eBook, which hopefully you've had a chance to digest, and we're delighted to be taking this to the next level as we look at practical ways to affect your transition. So we recognise the mobility landscape continues to change and we have to constantly respond and adapt to that change. What we've been seeing are organisations recognising the value of global mobility in corporate growth planning and the need to be more strategic, although many still have a way to go in moving from being seen as a standalone transactional function. More recently, and to enable mobility leads to focus on operating more strategically, we've seen many companies have outsourced some of the administrative elements of their programs, leveraging technology solutions and really benefiting from specialist skills and increased efficiencies. Of course, it does bring with it challenges around reduced control, sometimes less flexibility. Certainly data security risk is an issue that needs to be considered, and all of these need to be addressed.
That's true, Taryn. In fact, I hope you don't mind if I digress briefly. It just reminds me of something I heard a couple of days ago. You see, I have a 10-year-old and I was listening to a dad who happens to be the head of data security at a very large organization tell the story of the day that he discovered his 10-year-old daughter had a profile on Facebook. It was a friend who mentioned to him that morning he'd seen some pictures. So the dad confronted his little girl and she denied it, of course. The brother couldn't wait to get into trouble and showed him a photograph. There was no denying it. Despite the fact that she doesn't have a phone, she still had a Facebook profile. You see, she proudly informed him that she'd had to find a solution. So she'd outsourced it to her friend. Her friend set it up, created the password, and every morning before school they had a chat and she updated her status. And every evening she read any comments or messages to her. But of course, she didn't have any control over her account, so she didn't know her password, she didn't know how to log in, but she developed a strategy, and of course the administration had been taken care of. So I couldn't resist sharing that, given your reference to outsourcing and some of the data security challenges and lack of control.
Oh, that's a great example, Jules. As I said, considering where to shift the doing, so the outsourcing, co-sourcing, or shifting the administrative elements to an internal shared service center perhaps, is just one way of working towards becoming more strategic. The ultimate focus of this webinar series is for your mobility teams to really be able to demonstrate the value that global mobility deliver against business investment. So in other words, the ROI.
So to try and demonstrate what we mean by this next slide is a riff on Maslow and tries to really represent a global mobility hierarchy of value. You may identify with the stages represented as organizations move from being transactional, that is just getting the job done, to the pinnacle of success, delivering provable value to the business. So you can see at the base stage, you're really focused on moving people from A to B, delivering outstanding service, but being pretty reactive to business request and need.
Whereas a more developed program will reflect more focus on cost and compliance, but usually still has constant challenge to justify to the business why perhaps an assignee should or shouldn't receive certain benefits and allowances, and sometimes they're seen as a blocker when enforcing compliance, so for example immigration. You may have the foundations in place, knowing where your assignees are, what they're doing, and how much they're costing the business. And there may also be some form of governance process which details accountability for the success of the assignment and who has overall responsibility for the performance and potential against the assignment and individual objectives. So these may be in place, but how do we move up a level and really start to operate more strategically?
Well, typically, Taryn, I find that organizations have developed a mobility framework of some sort with some links to talent. They may have an efficient operating model, be maximizing planning opportunities, and perhaps even really starting to work on standardizing the consistent capture and delivery of compensation and payroll data globally. Many are considering a technology solution by which they can consolidate talent, payroll, demographic, compensation, and all expense-related data, and possibly even start to track data that they haven't previously identified or tracked before in an HRIS or mobility system. So by that, I guess I'm referring to the capture of perhaps total assignment costs that include non-cash, for example, equity compensation, but also things around assignment experience, acquired skills, performance over time, potential, etc. However, rather than merely just justifying the cost, tangible value comes when mobility are recognized as a true business partner, demonstrating return associated to cost. So how the assignment has directly contributed to business growth and profitability. This is the ultimate aim. And it's at this point it then becomes easier to start delivering metrics which help to measure the return on the investment. You can look at providing predictive analytics, so providing real-time what-if scenarios, for example, looking at cost trends or impact of policy changes, but in direct response to the market and business need at that time.
So we thought it would be helpful to touch on and refer at this point to some of the key barriers that I'm sure we've all encountered at some point. And being aware and able to identify the barriers that your company faces is really the first step towards adopting a strategic process. Identifying the obstacles and being aware will enable you to overcome some of those challenges and really to begin this transition journey. And the eBook that I mentioned earlier covers some of these barriers in more detail. I'm sure glancing through the list on your screen, you will identify with some of the barriers that are up there. And I'm just going to pick out a couple. Time is always one that comes up as a key challenge, as does lack of senior leadership or buy-in, and I'm sure you'll identify with those. So what we've done is we've created a framework that can be used as a blueprint to ultimately deliver a measurable value. And this framework is a structure for designing success. The pillars, as we've depicted them, are the cornerstones of global mobility. And by reviewing each of these areas, you build on a foundation of day-to-day process and service delivery to enable the transition from transactional to strategic. And if we just take a look at those pillars, the first is around strategy and core principles. This is really about defining and documenting your mobility strategy, aligned to HR and business strategies with agreed program principles. By understanding your organization's objectives and having a definition of the purpose of mobility within your business, you start to have a clearer sense of identity, making it easier to focus direction and articulate the value back to the business. And this really has got to be the starting point. Pillar number 2, program design and delivery. This is about policy, includes process, organization design, and your service delivery model, including both internal and external partners. The third pillar, data and technology. Here we're identifying and trying to capture and look at the sources of data, implementing an appropriate technology solution and associated mobility and data analysis tools, and then delivery of reporting and ultimately the metrics. And finally, risk and compliance. This is around identifying and managing risk, which is, so important in this regulatory environment, ensuring the appropriate levels of compliance to protect your organization, not only financial, but also reputationally.
Yes, and I guess given the amount to cover in each of these areas, and of course our belief that in order to prove value, it's really imperative that each of the pillars are sufficiently reviewed, we thought we'd take the approach of covering each of these pillars as separate topics in our webinar series. So today we're going to dive into strategy and core principles. Experience has taught us that it's really important to take a step back and ensure that the mobility mission, philosophy, strategy and principles are transparent and really agreed up front. So look out for the forthcoming webinars. If there's areas of particular interest you'd like us to include, let us know. And hopefully by the end of this series, we will have one big house, which is really a framework of the entire global mobility program and how to work towards maximizing value that mobility delivers to the business. So let's look at the pillar in more detail now and the building blocks that inform the strategy and principles.
Well, Jules and I run a number of roundtables throughout the year, and one of the topics which keeps popping up is how to increase the global mobility profile within an organization. And by defining, or in some instances redefining, your mission statement and your philosophy, what you do is start to create an opportunity to engage with key stakeholders in the business, as well as ensure that your global mobility strategy aligns with HR and business strategy.
Yes, Sharon, that's a good point, because to illustrate this, when I look back at some of the advisory projects we've worked on, we have requested and been granted access to executive board members, global business function leaders, and it's really been invaluable. We've met with and interviewed them to understand their business strategy and why they need to move people. Is it due to business growth or to resource projects, develop skill sets, as well as tackle, some of their key challenges or some of the barriers to mobility that they've faced.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting, Jules. I think a couple of the projects that we've recently worked on to jump out in that we were asked on one of those to engage at a very early stage with some of the key business stakeholders, and to really try to understand, or with the aim of trying to understand the business needs and ask them whether or what they felt was the value that they see mobility bringing or delivering to their business. And by doing that, we really got to grips with and understood some of those differences and some of the challenges that they faced. And that then helped to inform, how we then built and shaped their policies and processes. The other organization sort of took a different approach and decided their volumes were fairly low and they wanted to kind of dive straight in. So we didn't engage with or interview those key stakeholders up front. But what did happen is there was a realization probably about 6 weeks into the project that in fact the right decision really would have been and was to meet with those individuals and to talk to them about their needs and really understand the challenges. So what we ended up doing was actually scheduling those interviews, and it kind of moved 360 degrees or came full circle.
Yeah, and actually it created a lot of traction, right, for the mobility program as a whole, right? Because
Absolutely.
I remember that the executive board members were really quite excited about what was ahead, and it really felt great to have their complete support. And I know that when it comes to implementation of that project, it'll run a lot smoother. The other thing, Taryn, is one of the things that we talked about with the stakeholders when we were interviewing them was about policy principles and how they should underpin the global mobility policies. And, that was quite interesting because there was a real lack of understanding in terms of what that really would look like, but became so critical and valuable in the end.
And that's a really important point that you make there, Jules, because having policy principles that the business own and have bought into means that when policies are challenged later on, and again, I'm sure you've all experienced examples of this, there are clear principles to refer back to. The principles must obviously fit with your organization's culture and approach to rewarding and developing talent. So for example, a principle may be that policies should be equitable and reasonable and clearly stated, delivering a consistent approach to compensation and allowances. This is particularly helpful to refer back to when, for example, one division or function within the business wants to overcompensate, or alternatively, perhaps be too generous.
Yes, I remember back to some of our assignment management days and particularly struggling with some of the back office functions or where there were some more cost constraints stopping the business from cherry picking too much. Now, I appreciate that we do have to create policies that are flexible, adaptable to business need. But really, by having principles to refer back to, if you have a completely different approach, at least you're able to say, well, look, this is what was agreed. And actually, I think in this particular instance, it's not fair and reasonable, and it's going to create some disparity.
Yeah, and I think the results and the feedback certainly from some of those meetings that I've mentioned was that there was always a resounding feeling of inclusion and collaboration. And what this meant was that we gained buy-in and support and started to really raise the profile of global mobility. And that support is vital when it comes to implementation of any change.
Yes, when I think of a recent client project again, it was very interesting to hear just how different the focus and growth strategy were for different parts of the business. So one area, as an example, was focused on short-term commercial gain, while another was focused on the longer-term investment. So coming at it from completely different perspectives, which isn't ideal when you're trying to implement a global program and global policies. For another division, the sustainability of the business was resourcing and moving top talent in response to client demand, whilst another didn't want to lose key talent at all and have to backfill roles. So I guess this is a great example as to why the policy strategy and principles, as well as having defined move drivers, are so important. The move drivers then determine the policy or package eligibility. And sometimes when you've conducted this due diligence, you find that you have to push out the project end date, sometimes substantially, until you reach a point where everybody's either on the same page or you've made a conscious decision to perhaps do things slightly differently. So Taryn, also in your experience, how do the compensation elements and cost of mobility packages impact the principles?
Well, I think it's really a consideration around, how generous or how lean do you want to be. I think you need to consider where your organization benchmarks itself in the industry, your culture, company culture, and where you position your compensation levels and mobility allowances. So it's sort of not a siloed approach, but really consider a number of areas particular to your organization. And finally, we just wanted to talk about one of the building blocks, which is key really, governance. It cannot be ignored, particularly in this heightened regulatory environment that we're all operating in. So consider governance as one of your policy principles. Your policy should be consistent, have an element of transparency, be well documented, compliant, and ultimately minimize any risk for the organization. So for example, when the business requires someone urgently in a location where perhaps immigration is key and may delay the start date and ultimately impact revenue, it helps to refer them back to the agreed principle where global governance standards need to be upheld to ensure compliance and to reduce risk. And I think, Mike, we've probably been talking for a little while now, so can we perhaps turn to a couple of the questions that are coming in over the last, or have come in over the last 20 minutes or so?
Thanks very much, Taryn and Jules. Yes, everybody, the phone lines are open. The questions you can keep posting as we go along. If you want to ask Taryn and Jules anything about what you've heard over the last 20 minutes, please post them in. I think we can start looking at the challenges side of things first. So we've got a question coming from the group here. They want to know what the challenges that you faced through your interviews.
There's a couple of points there. One is actually identifying who those key stakeholders are or should be in your organizations. Really kind of identifying who has a vested interest in mobility and is going to support your case for change, and typically a leader who is, you know, well networked, and then look to try and engage senior leaders.
The one from Hannah, she's talking about challenges and stakeholders. She says, I'm having problems identifying stakeholders within my business. Most of them work overseas. Is there any kind of suggestions that you can do to provide me to help identify them or be able to engage with them a little bit more? So I
think this is something, Mike, that you know, comes up regularly, and certainly in the projects that Jules and I have worked on recently, you know, that was kind of some of the discussion really at the starting point, is who do we engage, you know, how do we get some of the senior leaders or stakeholders on side. And it really is, I think, identifying someone, you know, in a senior position that is going to buy in and is really going to support the change that you're trying to bring about and engage in that.
Yes, and I think as an added point, if it is really difficult within your organization, then look where the movement is. Who's moving the most people, and who's the senior individual who's signing those moves off, and maybe start there. Also, you know, head of reward, or just use your network, and you will be able to build a key stakeholder list. But I think people who really are business leaders who will influence decisions and who have the ability to sign off on moves and cost is a good starting.
Yeah, I think one of the learnings, you know, just going back to some of that those stakeholder interviews that we conducted, was really, you know, providing some of the context and the positioning and why Global Mobility, you know, do what they do, are aiming to, you know, implement change, become more strategic, and what that really means. Was we were absolutely, you know, surprised in some instances at just how much conversation it entailed from that conversation, and just how open and willing some of those senior level stakeholders were to being heard and actually engaging at that point.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, we've got one from Dirk here. He's talking about the value of assignments. He's wondering whether everything should be put down to pounds, shillings and pence, or dollars and cents, or whether there's some kind of softer measures that can be identified.
I think there's always softer measures. I mean, one of the things about looking at what the global mobility strategy is about is identifying the direction that the business wants to go in. And if the focus is on growth, you know, one of the greatest ways to support that is through international assignments. And it's also therefore a fantastic way to develop talent, to develop people, to take your top performers and give them global skills and a global mindset, just develop their careers. So I think that's always of value.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, Jules, you know, cost absolutely is key, but you know, we just need to sometimes be mindful or careful not to get too hung up on just that dollar number. So although it's extremely important, and you know, we'll get to sort of looking perhaps at how we can measure or produce some of those metrics in one of our later webinars. But I don't think, you know, we can just silo it out. As Jules says, there are other areas that absolutely contribute and should contribute to the broader picture of the value and reaching that more strategic approach.
And I think sometimes as well, I know this isn't like strictly focused on global mobility, but just as people, you know, we need to think broadly and think about, what really matters. Is it always cost, or do people really matter? And what are we supporting? So if we're looking at a charity, is what they're doing, that's what matters the most, and the people who deliver that are not so much, cost attached. And I may not be making too much sense here, but I think just sometimes we get so focused on, from a business perspective, that we don't take that aerial perspective, and we can get caught up in the numbers. But really, at the end of the day, it's what we're delivering, how we treat each other, and how we look after our people. I think that really matters just as much.
We've got another one from Sky here. They're asking about how do you create balance across the business in terms of what the value is of mobility. How do you define the value of mobility, given that you've got so many stakeholders with such different varying views on what it creates for the business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and one of the things that we really got to understand and appreciate through some of that stakeholder engagement was just how varied and how different some of the needs, of a business are within an organization. So, really those principles need to be at a fairly high level and be able to incorporate some of those differences, allowing flexibility, but providing that steer in the same direction. So, using the sort of the fair and reasonable approach, it's not necessarily, when you get to your policies, you're going to start to dive into the actual allowances and compensation, etc. But always being able to refer back to, are the decisions, is it just about cost cutting or throwing money at people versus that fair and reasonable approach?
And we did recognize as well that in the one particular organization, they did have different business needs. They were kind of decentralized. They weren't really operating as a global function, which does make it more challenging, in which case you put in the principles that you can, and as long as you're allowing consistency across those specific divisions as a first starting point, sometimes that's the only way you can get to initially. And then hopefully with further work, as you look to become more global, that will naturally come together.
Hans comments, flexibility is the key. I don't know whether you both agree with that in terms of overcoming the barriers. But could I just ask you a little bit about, if you could summarize what are the key barriers that you've seen through your advisory work so far and you're working with different clients? What seem to be the key barriers that really stand out?
I think, one has got to start with cost, because relocation is often seen as expensive, and sometimes assuming you can hire local talent in, assuming they have the skill set available, it can be more attractive than wanting to relocate someone. If you've got a smaller office and they're really resistant to releasing that talent, because it will then create a resulting skills gap. So we do see that barrier happen quite a lot. But then you've got to look back at your principles and your strategy and really question, as part of the growth strategy, is talent development part of that? And if it is, and if you need to focus on performance and potential and developing your best and your brightest, then you may have to look at ways in which you can create those opportunities despite cost. I think also the good old return of investment is hard to quantify. That definitely creates an impact. Sometimes you don't have a really formal or well-structured or well-resourced mobility machine, so business might want to do their own things. And finally, I'd have to say it's that reluctance to change and not being open to change sometimes, or having the intent to change and to get rid of some of those barriers and move forward. It can create a lot of work and involve a lot of time, but change is good. It's always worth it.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess we'll stop the questions there. I'm sorry we didn't get through all your questions posted. We'll invariably try to get back to you directly after the webinar. We're going to kind of draw to a close at the moment. Taryn, Jules, if you want to take this last bit before I finish off.
Sure. As you work through the webinar series, there are some key considerations to come back to regularly, and there's 7 sort of listed on the slide deck. I think I'll just pick out a few that are jumping out at me. I think being prepared to do things differently, taking an aerial perspective and challenging existing processes and ways of working, really critical. You've got to have the intent and be prepared to want to change. Change is good, as well as overcoming the time barrier. We know too well just how easy it is in this kind of field and this area to feel under-resourced and just not enough hours in a day. But I think at the end of the day, where there is a will, there is always a way.
Never a truer word. Okay, all right.
So as we thank you for joining us for this past half hour, there's just a question that I thought we'd leave you with, and we'll continue to pick up the next in the series. But really, just how are you going to identify the value of mobility to your business?
Just like to show you this infographic at the end as well. So this subject was run past a live focus group, and the results plotted in this infographic. So we've sketched it all out. Hopefully you can all hear me. It's a bit difficult to read on a screen, so what we'll do is we'll share this with everybody who's been on this webinar after this. It plots the journey from just getting the job done to maximising the value of mobility to your business. Well, thank you very much everybody for joining us today. We're going to wrap up now. We'll be sending you some requests for some feedback so we can improve what we do on the next ones. Hopefully you'll join us in the future for the rest of this series. So thank you very much. Thank you from Taryn, Jules and myself.
So good morning to you, but good night from us.
And have a good day.
Yes.
Terrific. Okay, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day and catch you again soon.